strategic implications and prospects. Before our first panel and our keynote address, I would like to say a few remarks about the technicalities of our online conference. First of all, I ask everyone who is not a presenter to switch off their microphone and camera. This conference is recorded. By participating in the conference, you accept it to be recorded. At the end of each panel, there is going to be a question and answers section. I ask everyone to send their questions to me through the chat of the Zoom video conference, and then I will pose the questions to our presenters. I ask our presenters to be very punctual. You have 15 minutes for your presentation. And now, before our first panel, I introduce our keynote lecturer, Professor László Trócsányi, member of the European Parliament, former Minister of Justice. Professor, please, you can start your keynote lecture now. Your microphone is muted.
Yes. Many thanks for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to me to participate in this conference. I have to say also that I can say that this topic is very important for me. I work in the European Parliament as a rapporteur for Morocco and the shadow rapporteur for Lebanon. It means as a Minister of Justice, I visited many times this region, and for me, the relationship with the Maghreb country and Mashrek country, I think is very important. We Europeans love to talk about ourselves. But today, I think it's very important also that to analyze what is the role of Europe in the world. As you know, also, the European Union decided to launch a conference, a future on the Europe. It means that the topic is on the table. There are going to be debates about the mission of Europe, as well as about the relationship with the neighbor countries. The European Union considers it important to shine and show its good sides. The question, however, is whether Europe can shine in the world today. Are our neighbors satisfied with the worldview the European Union and its member states have on them? Reflection is important, and we need to think through how we regard our southern neighbors and how they regard us 25 years after the Declaration of Barcelona. In my brief introduction, I would like to rely on my experience in the European Parliament. First of all, I would like to speak about the general approach of the member states and neighborhood policies. Member states of the European Union are not equally interested in neighborhood policies. I know that generalization is always very dangerous. However, I try to classify member states of the European Union based on how they relate to the neighborhood policies of the European Union. In my eyes, Poland, the Baltic states, partly Germany, and countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the Eastern Partnership and the Balkan are primarily important for geographical reasons. They regard the southern states with caution, mostly for security reasons, and mostly because our information of the region is sometimes limited. For them, the priority is to support the countries of the Eastern Partnership. In contrast, Latin countries are particularly interested in what is happening on the other side of the Mediterranean. They have a more robust geopolitical interest, and thus they pay much more attention to what is happening in the region. For them, monetary support and development of this region is particularly important. Besides, the security considerations, such as the question of migration, are not small. The northern Scandinavian countries think it is important how democracy is implemented there. They wish to enforce a strict relation between human rights and the financial aid of the European Union. Democracy export is desirable in their point of view. Therefore, when the institution of the European Union, Commission, the Parliament, and the Council take a position on the Southern neighborhood policy, they need to take into consideration the various viewpoints and interests of the member states. Consequently, the European Union is not in an easy position when it has to define the priorities of the Southern neighborhood policies. The major aspects are economic development, border control, democracy export, conditionality. The EU visa policy is another relating aspect which is considered differently on the two sides of the Mediterranean. Now I would like to continue with the other question. Can we narrow down this question only to the relationship between the European Union and the Maghreb and the Mashrek countries? In certain sense, yes. If we look at it from an official perspective, and if we count the Palestinian National Authority, there are 10 countries that are concerned. The European Union concluded an association agreement with them. This includes the political dialogue, the economic and cultural cooperation. The financial aid of these countries were carried out from the European Neighborhood Instrument until 2020. Under the new EU investment, up to 7 billion euro for the period 2021-2027 would be allocated to its implementation, which could mobilize up to 30 billion euro in private and public investment in the region in the next decade. In my opinion, however, the geopolitical situation is far more complex than to narrow it down to the question of the Euro-Mediterranean cooperation, as it would be too small. The Northern African states have a bridge function between Europe and the Sahel zone, moreover, in a broader sense between Europe and Africa. Therefore, they are key players for geopolitical and security reasons. It is better, therefore, to look at the three regions together. The problems of the Sahel zone directly concern the Maghreb and Mashrek countries, but they have serious repercussions on Europe too. The third question, whether the Maghreb and the Mashrek countries considered as homogeneous. There are, of course, common points between the countries. The demographic situation, the migration, the climate change, the environmental challenges, and the economic social problems are many times similar in each of these countries, let alone the culture that connect these countries. However, there are significant differences too. Libya has got involved in the civil war. We see how the United Nations, the Arab League, and the African Union, the European Union look for a solution for Libya. The situation is extremely difficult. Morocco modified its constitution at the beginning of the Arab Spring and managed to stabilize his position. There is near bankrupt situation in Lebanon, and the country has no real government. They would like to organize a new election, but it's not easy because the different community lives together, the Druze, the Maronite, the Sunnite, and the Shiite, and so on. It is very complicated, the situation, to find a solution in this country. There are tensions in Algeria too. It means the situation is not easy. The Arab Spring, this or that way, had an impact on each country. The stabilization cannot be deemed fast or highly visible. And I have forgotten to speak, it was Egypt also, because in Egypt, after the Morsi, the consolidation needed to happen. Iraq is in a phase of post-war consolidation. It means there are the refugees of Syria. It means that the situation very complicated from Brussels, seeing that everything from Brussels. The cooperation in the region is very difficult also among the different countries. If you speak the western, the zone of Sahel, we can see the differences also the Polisario between Algeria and Morocco. The European Union wants to reinforce the regional cooperation there, but it has significant barriers today. In sum, the Arab Spring launched the process of democratization, but the stabilization needs time. The responsibility of the European Union and its member states cannot be downplayed. I myself was the ambassador of Hungary in Paris when the Arab Spring began, so I could watch closely how the regime of Ben Ali or Gaddafi collapsed. I followed what steps the French government took after the Syrian war to organize the Friends of Syria group. It is hard to assess 10 years after the Arab Spring. Moreover, Europe has new challenges to cope with, as illustrated by the migration wave. A lot of issues need to be rethought on both sides of the Mediterranean. Europe should not play the role of a teacher or preacher at the southern neighbors. It is a mistake. Only an equal partnership can bring fruitful cooperation. Europe needs to recognize that actors like China, Turkey, let alone the United States of America have engaged at our southern neighbors. If the European Union wants to remain credible, it needs a change of attitude. I welcome the conference with joy. I am waiting to see what our southern neighbors think about the Europe, how they see the cooperation in the future. Our southern neighbors can be sure that Hungary and myself regards them as friends, and I myself in the European Parliament stand up for a cooperation on an equal footing. I think this conference can help for us also because we are interested what is the situation in the other side of the Mediterranean. The cooperation among us is very important with the equal position. Many thanks for this possibility that I explained my position, how I see the Arab Spring and the consequences of Arab Spring today. Thank you very much.
Professor Trocani, thank you very much for your introductory remarks. And now we are moving on to our first panel, which is going to focus specifically on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. Our first presenter is Professor Erzsébet Nagyné Rózsa from the University of Public Service, and she's going to start our section with some introductory remarks on the subject. Professor, please start your presentation now.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation and also for the possibility to meet so many friends and colleagues, even if via the internet. I was asked to give a kind of an introduction in some introductory remarks. So this is what I would like to do, to raise a couple of thoughts, probably setting the tone, where did we start from? And of course, the first question is if the Arab Spring is a beginning or it is just one phase of the development. As we all know, at the very end of December 2010, it all started in Tunisia. Then it didn't spread, but then similar events took place in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and even tiny Bahrain, which was the one and only country so far which is of a monarchy pattern of state. The slogans are also well known: Adala, Karama, Iskat al-Nizam, so social justice, human dignity, and the fall of the regime. And when people were wondering at the time of the Arab Spring events, and let me refer to them as the Arab Spring because for many reasons, I know there were a lot of discussions if it's a spring or not a spring. I think that if we take it as an Arab Spring, as it is or still referred to in many Arab countries, we can keep this phrase for today's conference. What were the problems? What were the factors that were initiating these kind of uprisings or even revolutions, as they were called, the Sauras in the Arab world, in the Arab countries? The factors were very well known well before. The series of Arab Human Development Reports, if you check them even today, would put in front of you all the main social, economic, and even political reasons what were in the background. And especially the economic liberalization hit very hard the different societies across the different Arab countries. Here it's enough to refer to the IMF loans and the severe conditions the IMF put to accepting such loans by any Arab country that wanted to take such a loan. However, we can also say that in this regard, I mean, the economic liberalization, the changes of the economic system had been relevant well before the Arab Spring events. It's enough to refer back a decade before or even more before to the so-called bread uprisings in some of the Arab countries, like in Algeria, but elsewhere as well. So it was a well-known fact that there is a social dissatisfaction, probably in most of the Arab countries, although to different extents and based on the different context in each and every country. However, what we could say was that all this was taking place in the context of a Western democratization phase, the Western democratization narratives and even operations. And there were many, but here I would just like to refer to the plan of George W. Bush, the President of the United States, of the democratization of the greater Middle East, which came to be considered as covering the whole of the Islamic world, by the way. And it was based on the conviction that democracies don't fight each other. So the perception was that if these countries would turn into democracies, then the endless wars and armed conflicts in the Middle East would come to an end. On the other hand, there was the example of the regime changes in Central and Eastern Europe, which gave the impression to the outsider that there is a democratization wave going through the whole of the world, and look at this region, all of the countries became democracies. And over the Arab Spring, a lot of conferences were organized about how to give over the experiences of transition in Central Europe to the countries of the region, which were Arab Spring countries, which were undergoing probably a similar way of transition. Now the question was, and I try to change my slide, yes, what order was there, what order was challenged, and what order came into being? Now the biggest issue was that all through, let's say, past 200 years, the patrimonial societies of the region, and now let's speak about the Arab countries, were challenged by two main factors, two main developments. One was the European kind of modernization. I always say that European because it is the modernization that we Europeans understand under modernization. And we all know that at first it took the form of colonization, the mandate system, the protectorate system, the several different solutions which the different countries in the Arab world have undergone and have experienced. The other big impression, the big influence over the region, over the development of the region was globalization as it happened all around the world. And what happened as a result of these two main influences, these two main developments was that nation states were introduced into the Arab world, into a place, into societies which before knew the city-states, knew the tribes, knew empires, but states as such, as they were understood by the expanding Europe, by the European modernization, that was a new phenomenon in the region. However, the borders were drawn into among the Arab countries, and with that, new political structures and institutions, both the result of the European modernization, some countries got it in the course of the colonization, some countries got it later or in other forms, and new institutions and as globalization were introduced. So what were these? Parliament, parties, constitution, even international law, or the issue of human rights. These structures, institutions, ideas reached the different now Arab countries that came to be 22 at different phases, in different forms, and through different channels. However, here were the patrimonial societies with their patrimonial structure, and here were these new formats, new limits, new structures imposed from the outside, which resulted in a kind of a dual character. In sociology, they use the term real sphere and virtual sphere of political participation on decision making, and in fact, this was what happened. And since the Arab societies were distributed, divided into 22 different political actors, political entities, each and every of them are different, have undergone this dual character, have lived this dual character. So what we can say that here are the new political structures, here are the political actors. However, since they were raised and have lived and are coming from a patrimonial system, they are bringing that kind of a heritage with them, which they try to adapt to the international norms. So what the result is a very complex thing, kind of modern political institutions, for example, the parties, but filled by the traditional elements, the traditional political actors, and in their operation, they still show signs of archaic structures. Here, I would like to emphasize that the different Arab countries show different phases of developments of these imported structures, the imported state, and the traditional social structure, how they are working together. Practically each and every Arab country should be analyzed separately, which my colleagues are going to do very soon. Now, what has changed in the Arab world? The first wave of change was the Arab revolutions of the 1950s and 60s, partly due to gaining independence, partly due to military coup d'etats, where the military elite, the modernizing, the national feeling, Arab nationalist military taking over, providing a new elite. However, even in their new structures, this old same traditional elements could be detected. And in a way, the same social contract was valid between the new elite and between the society. But don't forget that there were many Arab states which did not undergo or which have not undergone so even today this kind of development. When in 2011, the so-called Arab Spring started, it started as elements or events or developments of a grassroots democratization. I still remember that visiting the different countries in the region, my Arab colleagues and friends and political analysts were all pointing out that, now look, this is democratization. You Europeans always told us that we are not able to do it. Look. And frankly speaking, as the event started, it was, to me at least, the most beautiful chances and developments of grassroots democratization. The people went out to the street, the people demonstrated peacefully, and the main leaders had to go out of office, at least in the first countries, Tunisia, Egypt. However, since the people were not organized into political actors, into political parties, soon the organized forces took over the developments with all the positive and sometimes with the negative aspects as well. Who were these two organized forces? The military and the Islamists. Now, the military was well known to all of the society, and they were familiar actors. They were also trusted actors, especially, for example, like in Egypt, And in other countries where there was a conscript-based army, and the military was behaving, should I say so, behaving or operating in a very positive way in the course of the Arab Spring developments. We can still remember the photos from the Tahrir Square in Cairo, where the children were playing with the soldiers, and when the military said that, no, we are not shooting at our people, whatever orders we are getting. So the military was, in a way, a known actor, a familiar actor. Most families had something to do with it, and so on. And it was a trusted actor as well. Now, the other actor was the Islamists, and that was a little bit more difficult to weigh, to evaluate what kind of an impact they have on the society. In most of the countries, they had limited political participation. In some countries, their evaluation was differing. At some points, they could quietly participate in the political processes. Then at some point, they were the main enemies in some other countries and so on. They did have some governance activities in the course of their charity activities. However, they usually have not come into a governing experience regarding a whole country. And because of the much sympathy from the society, it was absolutely unknown how much popular support they could get. When they became a legalized political actor, and I think this was one of the most important aspects in the Arab Spring, that they became a legalized, legitimate political actor, in many places, they came into governing position, and sometimes it turned out that their practice was not enough, since they had never been in such position before. But we also have to emphasize that they themselves were in transition in the course of the events, and they were challenged. And here I put the Muslim Brotherhood, because this was the most visible and the most prominent actor at the time. They were also challenged by other Islamist groups, not by the seculars. And the question can be raised if a new order was evolving. Now, what are the chances? One of the important elements that we can say is that in most of the region, technical development preceded the kind of social development Europe had gone through before we came to our kind of democracies. Here there were two actors, the youth in particular and the people in general, some of which did try to organize into political actors, and some of which in this way could gain a say, at least to a limited extent, in the political processes. But I expect more to come in the future. The big question, if the Islamists will change or if they can change. And the main question is if they are ready to participate in the political game, even if they are losing. The big question was put to them in Tunisia, for example, when they lost the second elections. If they are ready to operate, to participate in political decision-making, even if they lose in an opposition role. And then the third element that could be raised is that it seems that in the course of these developments, some change is almost certainly there. But it seems as if a new patrimonial order, maybe a neo-patrimonial order, is in the formation in many countries. Here there is a caricature that I put in. It is about the Libyan case, the Libyan Thawra, the Libyan revolution, which in a way supports my idea that the old political actors who were united before the revolution are coming out as new actors, but in fact, sometimes the very same actors. By the way, I have to mention it here, where here in Central Europe, it's very clear that this was one of the main questions in the Central European transition, to which different countries they gave different answers. And my very last slide, and I'm sorry, one of my favorite ideas, how the state identities have changed. In the Middle East and among the Arab countries, state identities have come to be now openly consist of three main elements. Obviously, these are Arabic countries. However, their Arabness, their Arab character has come to mean a much more cultural, historical, and also an emotional layer. Are there any more Arab common positions? Not at the moment. The two main outstanding issues were Palestine, and we have just seen that the Abraham Accords have just shaken the very foundation of the 2002 Arab peace plan, unity of the Arab countries. The other issue was the Israeli nuclear capability, over which the Arabs tried, united, to represent their view, and they could never get through. The big question, of course, is the Iranian nuclear, but many Arab countries like Morocco, that Mr. Minister has mentioned before, is not very much interested in that. The other characteristic, obviously, is the Islamic characteristics with its cultural, civilization, and political role in the life of each and every country. And then there are differences to what extent Islam can play a political role in that specific country. And as I said, an enhanced and even legitimized political role to the Islamists, maybe temporarily, maybe once and for all, maybe to this Islamic group, yes, to the other one, no, and so on. But the most important development for me, at least from my perspective, was the national identity. National identity in the sense that it evolved related to the territorial state. So we could say that 100 years or approximately 100 years after the boundaries of the Arab countries were drawn, a kind of identity to the territorial state has evolved. We have been aware of that factor for a long while. There were the stereotypes between the different Arab publics in this country and that country and how they were speaking of each other. But here in the Arab Spring events, this has become a very clear signal that these are different countries, and the main difference is that each and every of them have now evolved, developed a territorial state-based identity. So after all, the big question is, can there be an all-Arab position afterwards? Could there be such an issue that can raise it, that can be raised, or we have to forget our terminology, the Arab world, at least in the political sense. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would like to give back the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. The second lecture of the first panel is Professor Gamal Selim from the British University of Egypt. The title of his presentation is 10 Years After Egypt January 25th Revolution, Reflections on Domestic and Regional Politics. Professor, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Rector. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting conference. It has been a long since we last met in Budapest, and I'm glad that we are meeting again, although it's online, but anyway, much better than nothing. I will try to be as brief as possible in order to adhere to the time limit. So my presentation today is about providing a balance sheet to the Egyptian January Revolution. And I will try to provide some reflections on domestic and regional politics with respect to the last 10 years. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, you see.
Very good, very good. Okay. So first of all, I would like to go briefly over the causes of the Egyptian revolution, because in order to provide an honest and credible balance sheet, it's important to compare the final outcomes with the original causes and the original objectives of the revolution. So in that respect, I would like to say that the January 2011 revolution was an outcome of three main factors, okay? The first factor, as Elizabeth mentioned in her presentation, was the persistence of various forms of economic decay and social injustice. In fact, I would say that this is considered the major factor which ignited the January revolution in Egypt. The anti-regime mobilization that dominated Egypt before the revolution was basically an outcome of different forms of economic and social injustice. So it was basically a revolution for economic and social development rather than a revolution for democratization, as some narratives actually would say in certain academic and policy-oriented circles. However, that does not mean that democracy was not involved. In fact, the second factor, or the second igniting factor, was the repressive nature of the Egyptian regime, particularly that this was coming at the age of globalization, information technology, and the democratization process which followed the 9/11 events. So it came as part of this overall American-led democracy promotion programs in the Middle East. However, I would say that this democratization element would come second to the socioeconomic problems. Third, also, we need to look at the foreign policy dimension of the Egyptian revolution. And here comes the major problem, which is the dependence of the Mubarak regime on foreign power, particularly the United States, and how this subordination, if you will, led eventually to the decline of Egypt's regional and global role in the last 20 years. So there was a general impression that Egypt has lost its influential position in the Middle East, and Egypt is no longer the leading actor in the region. And this role was always considered a pivotal role that Egypt would always play, actually, back in history. So there was a sense that Egypt is losing, both domestically and regionally speaking as well. With respect to the balance sheet I'm trying to provide, I would say that, or my argument here, and maybe some people can agree with me on that, or others may differ with me, contrary to the expectations, the elements of continuity were far more powerful than the elements or the propensities for change during the periods of SCAF and the Brotherhood-led regime of Mohammed Morsi. Okay, so this is despite the fact that the revolutionary sentiment in Egyptian politics was at its peak during the period of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the period of Mohammed Morsi. This was the period where revolutionary politics was at the highest level. However, that was not reflected in genuine transformation, and it was not reflected in major changes, either domestically or at the level of foreign policy. At the same time, although the rise of Sisi to power has been portrayed in several narratives as coinciding with the end of the revolutionary zeal in contemporary Egypt, it was only then, it was only in the period of post-2013 that Egypt has been able to achieve some of the core objectives or some of the core demands of the revolution. So it was interesting to see how actually these objectives were met. So under the ruling periods of SCAF, and SCAF here refers to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which took over after the fall of Mubarak, and also under the ruling period of the Muslim Brotherhood, there was a clear pattern of continuity with Mubarak's Egypt at the domestic and foreign policy levels. And that continuity pattern could be seen in the following three main domains. First, the economic decay and the perpetuation of social injustice as a result of the persistence of the neoliberal economic orientation that was followed after the fall of Mubarak, and also the continual absence of the developmental state in Egypt. So with respect to the economic domain, nothing has changed with respect to the economic orientation of both SCAF and the Muslim Brotherhood. They continued with the same philosophy of economic neoliberalism and the complete absence of a strong developmental state, which means that the same issues or the same problems of socioeconomic injustice continue to prevail and continue to dominate the scene. Also, despite the fact that there were some political opening following the fall of Mubarak, authoritarian practices continued in a way or another under both SCAF and the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, there were times in which political repression was clearly evident under the period of Mohammed Morsi, particularly when the Islamists tried to control the major institutions of the state, and thus they were attempting to undermine all other liberal and revolutionary forces in the context of this controlization or this process to control the state. And also another or a third pattern of the continuity was seen in the dependency on Western and American powers. So there was a general impression that nothing has changed 2 years after the revolution, and that led to the continuation of the same sources of resentment at the popular level. Nothing has been achieved and nothing actually has moved forward. Under the presidency of Sisi, Egypt has been able actually to achieve 2 core objectives of the revolution. And as I said, this achievement was done despite the fact that President Sisi belonged to the military institution, and thus it was interesting to see how the major objectives of the revolution were met under a non-revolutionary institution, under a non-revolutionary order. The first actually achievement was reflected in the implementation of a comprehensive socio-economic development at the domestic level. And the second achievement was evident in the restoration of Egypt's influential role in the region and international politics. So throughout an active developmental state and the implementation of state-led capitalism, which combines neoliberal reforms, neoliberal economic reforms with the state control over the economy, Egypt actually has been able to achieve a comprehensive program of socio-economic development, and that was reflected in the massive investments which took place in infrastructure projects, food security projects, energy, and social housing, healthcare programs, and social protection programs at a very wide scale level. So it was the first time since since the period of Nasser that the state was able to restore an active, strong developmental role in the economy after almost 5 or 4 decades of gradual withdrawal from the socio-economic domain. So that was considered a major achievement at the time under the presidency of Sisi. Also at the level of foreign policy, and in a major departure from its subordinate foreign policy since the Camp David order in the late 1980s, Egypt has been able to formulate a new foreign policy doctrine after 2013. In fact, the new doctrine has gradually developed into 3 main directions. The first is the establishment of balanced relationships with the great powers and key regional actors. The second is respect for the traditional notions of sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs of other states. And third, which is the most important, is the nationalistic reassertion of Egypt's freedom of maneuver within the region. So there was a clear departure from Mubarak's foreign policy particularly when it comes to its subordination to Western powers and its subordination to certain regional actors within the region. And that change was clearly evident in Egypt's strategic engagement with other great powers such as China and Russia. It was also evident in Egypt's restoring back its active regional role in the Middle East after decades of subordination and decline. However, notwithstanding this achievement, we have to admit that democracy has remained stagnant in Egypt 10 years after the revolution, with severe restrictions still being imposed on political liberties. However, it's important to understand this regression in the level of political freedoms in the context of Egypt's severe fight against terrorism, particularly following the 2013 uprising, which led to the ouster of President Morsi from power. So since the ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood-led regime in the 2013 popular uprising, Egypt has been facing an unprecedented level of security threats at the hands of domestic and transnational terrorist groups, which actually infiltrated the borders of the country from almost all directions. You have the Libyan borders, which was totally under no control after the fall of Gaddafi, which led to the proliferation and the smuggling of weaponry systems, militant groups, jihadi militant elements from Libya into Egypt. And there was also the Eastern Front, like the borders with the Gaza Strip, where the Muslim Brotherhood, in connection with the Hamas movement in Gaza, was able actually to use the Egypt-Gaza border and to use the tunnels under the borders actually to smuggle all these terrorist and heavy weaponry systems inside the Sinai. So there was a turbulent security environment following the 2013. And in the context of this security environment, it was logical that the Egyptian government actually will take extraordinary security measures in order to restore order and to restore stability to the country at all prices. So it was a very difficult moment and it was a very difficult period. And I remember it took almost 3 to 4 years until things began to stabilize and some sort of order actually began to take place. So in that context, it's important to understand that the regime has given priority to stability over political and democratic reforms. And this approach has been largely tolerated and even supported by the majority of the Egyptians as a result of the state of instability and chaos following the 2011 and 2013 uprising. So despite the fact that democracy continued to regress and to decline in Egypt 10 years after the revolution, there was an overall public understanding that other important and more important goals must be realized before democracy actually can take off. And that's why it's not a matter of contention, or it's not an issue which can cause public discontent at the present time. Despite the retreat in the level of political and democratic rights, there is a general public understanding that we need to give priority to order and stability, particularly that following the 2011 revolution, there was a massive decline in the economic well-being of the vulnerable majority of Egyptians due to the decline of major sources of revenues, like you have tourism, you have the Suez Canal, you have foreign investments, you have several mega projects which came to full stagnation after the revolution, which actually had negative and disastrous economic repercussions for the majority of Egyptians. So in this turbulent economic situation and in this turbulent security environment, most Egyptians now are in full understanding that stability and order should come first, and that's why there is a general public support to the regime policies and to the regime approach in this respect, which explains why now democracy is not a hot topic, or democracy is not an issue that you can easily discuss or can attract attention either in public circles or in policy-oriented circles. And this is the end of my presentation, and I hope I did not take more than 15 minutes.
Thank you for your presentation. I kindly remind our guests that at the end of the panel, we are going to have a question and answer section. So feel free to send your questions to me directly on the chat of the Zoom conference. Our third presenter is Omar Saifo, who is a researcher at the Migration Research Institute. The title of his presentation is going to be Syria After 10 Years. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the lecturers for all these insightful lectures, and thank you also for those attending this online lecture. So, so can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Can you see it now? No? Okay, just a second. Just a second, please. And now?
Now we can see your presentation.
Wonderful. So rather than discussing the Syrian conflict as it is, please allow me to discuss the Syrian conflict in general through the lens of the refugee crisis in the country, which provides us plenty of space to discuss all the political and social developments in the country. To understand the present situation of the refugees in Syria, we need to start with the roots of the conflict. First, the population of Syria doubled from 10 million in 1990 to more than 20 million in 2010. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, approximately 2.5 million Iraqis arrived to the country, who contributed to the growth of rent prices and the congestion in large cities, mainly the capital, Damascus. Bashar al-Assad practically inherited presidency from his father, Hafez al-Assad, in 2000. His rise to power was a narrowing of what we might call networks of privilege within the Syrian business community. His father, Hafez al-Assad, was fully aware that his own political position will be stronger if he gives others a stake in expanding the economy. Meanwhile, Bashar al-Assad, in order to strengthen his position in the face of what was called the old guard, facilitated the emergence of a young generation of businessmen like his maternal cousin, Rami Makhlouf. This new elite was who mainly benefited from the economic reform of the 2000s that drove real estate prices and the prices of many consumer goods high. The economy was also affected by a devastating drought between 2006 and 2010, affecting most of the fertile lands of the country. The 4 years of drought turned almost 60% of Syria into a desert and affected the livelihood of 1/3 of the population. In this period, approximately 3 million rural people, certainly we do not have exact numbers, what we're talking about 3 million rural people moved into the cities in search for a job. Many of them settled in urban suburbs and lived in unregistered homes known as ashwaiyat or informals. Because of bureaucracy and also corruption, by 2010, about 8 million people lived in such real estate, and 40% of Syrian homes were not properly registered. On the top of all these, a global financial crisis started in 2008, dramatically reducing foreign investment, the flow of foreign investment to Syria. By 2010, when the first signs of the Arab uprisings appeared in Tunisia, the government of Syria was no more able to fulfill its part of the social contract with the people. According to this decade-long unwritten contract, the government provided free education and social service for the people, and also consumer subsidies for food, electricity, water, fuel, etc. In return, the people did not challenge the government's authority. This economic collapse also led to the collapse of local networks of patronage, affecting the authority of the government. Not surprisingly, the early demonstrations in 2011 erupted in economically disadvantaged urban neighborhoods and the impoverished countryside. Most of the early defectors, most of the early army defectors hailed from such neighborhoods, and such areas became the hotbed of newly formed rebel militias, secularist and Islamist alike. Rebels drove out government forces from many economically disadvantaged areas, to which the army responded by some sort of collective punishment, like dropping barrel bombs and destroying entire neighborhood. As a result, about 5.6 million Syrians are refugees, and other 6.1 million people are displaced within Syria. According to the polls, most of them are hostile to the regime. The influx of Syrian refugees into Jordan and Lebanon has challenged both countries economically, politically, and also threatened the demographic fabrics of the countries. The situation is especially tense in Lebanon, where refugees account for most than 1/5 of the population. In Turkey, the social and economic situation is also tense, and partly because of the presence of Syrians, the ruling party suffered a setback in the last local elections in many major cities. And we also see that this refugee situation affected the European societies and politics as well. So now, after 10 years of fighting, we see that since Russia and Turkey agreed on a ceasefire in Idlib province last March, the war has basically turned into a low-intensity conflict. The country is basically split into 4 parts, and let's start from the north and move to the south. So areas in the northeast are controlled by Kurdish forces with very minor American presence, which is still enough to provide protection for the Kurdish allies of the Americans. Territories in the north are controlled by groups supported by Turkey, and the Turkish army is also present there on the ground. These territories are basically economically annexed to Turkey, with the Turkish lira in use and an intense flow of goods between the countries. In the northwest, we see Idlib, where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham emerged as the strongest faction, which is basically an Islamist faction with former ties to Al-Qaeda. And to Idlib province, many rebels were bust when they were surrounded by regime forces in Damascus, Aleppo, and other fronts of the war. Like the northern part, Idlib is also economically dependent on Turkey. The government has regained control of Syria's biggest cities, so now we're moving to the south, and rules approximately 70% of the country. For a number of reasons, including massive destruction of Syrian infrastructure, the crisis of the Lebanese banking system, and the dire economic situation of Assad's allies like Russia and Iran, Syria's economy is crumbling. Certainly the regime is using international sanctions as an excuse for this, but the situation is more complicated. And in general, we see that a number show that the Syrian GDP declined by 70%, and about half of the people are unemployed, and the Syrian pound lost 99% of its value since the war started. In Assad-ruled Syria, the conflict tore down, and now we're moving to the social level. So the conflict tore down pre-war business networks and networks of economic patronage. Among the many changes that have affected the economy is the consumption of the Syrian, composition of the Syrian business elite, including the demise of Rami Makhlouf and the rise of other strongmen like Samir Fowz and many other war profiteers. Speaking on a bit lower level, we see that during the war, many local strongmen formed militias and made a fortune. As fighting ended, wartime profiteers are basically laundering their gains and tapping their influence into the official economy and also politics. In new networks, especially in this present dire economic situation, it's hard to see if there is a space for potential refugees to return to government-controlled areas. So we can ask, so if there is a hope for return of the refugees. We see that in Idlib province, there is already an estimated 2.5 million displaced people, including a million of children, many of those living in hard conditions in refugee camps. Therefore, the province is, we can say, basically full with little space for potential newcomers. Speaking about the northern part, controlled by Turkey, according to Turkish official sources, more than 400,000 Syrians already returned from Turkey to these areas. Certainly, we do not know if the numbers are correct. What we surely know that the infrastructure of this northern part is not developed, not advanced enough to welcome new masses of people. And also, we know for certain that many of those who were sent back from Turkey to these areas were basically not original from these areas. Therefore, the social fabric and the ethnic fabric of these areas basically changed. From the Syrian government's point of view, we see that driving away non-loyalist population was regarded as a part of the solution of the conflict from the very beginning. So the president and his allies are basically very happy to see more than 5 million hostile people outside the borders of the country. So since the early years of the conflict, the government introduced a set of regulations, making it as hard as possible for potentially hostile displaced people and refugees to return. In 2012, a decree was introduced about the so-called development of areas of unauthorized housing and informal settlements. This decree targeted the ashwaiyat, so this informal neighborhoods. Those, as we mentioned before, made up 40% of the Syrian homes and were hotbed of the uprising. The free interpretation of this decree enabled the government to demolish entire neighborhoods and redistribute strategically important areas between loyalist businessmen. Another decree of 2012 was about the seizure and expropriation of movable and immovable property belonging to those deemed to be terrorists. Certainly, the interpretation and the definition of terrorism is very different from a Syrian regime's point of view. So many of those who are involved in oppositional activities are regarded as terrorists. So, still, the biggest blow for the chance of return was the law number 10 of 2018, which allowed creating development zones across Syria that will be designated for reconstruction. The law does not set out any clear criteria for which areas can be designated as a redevelopment zone, or doesn't really set out a timeline. Instead, these the redevelopment zones are to be designated by decree, and the law allowed previous owners of these infrastructure to claim their ownership within 30 days, which many displaced people and refugees failed to fulfill. Of course, the laws also made it possible for relatives of the owners to claim ownership in these buildings, which many of them failed to do in fear of political retaliation or so on. And we see a new legislation recently, which is about a new project aimed at issuing new ID cards. So we see that about 10 million Syrians are in a risk of being stripped of the most basic rights in their country. So to issue a new ID card, a face-to-face meeting with the authorities is needed, which only can be done in government-controlled territories. Therefore, millions of displaced Syrians are in danger of not getting the new ID cards, either because they are refugees or because they live in territory not controlled by the state. And it's reported that those who fail to report the civil registry in Assad-controlled regions will lose their right to citizenship and property. So to sum up the whole presentation, we see that the war in Syria tore down previous social networks and economic networks of patronage. New middlemen between the state and society arose, and simply we see very little space for those who left out of the redistribution in the country to claim their space in the Syrian society, at least in government-controlled areas, but also beyond. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Omar, for your presentation. And the first panel's last presenter is our very own research director, Victor Marshai. The title of his presentation is 10 Years After Gaddafi, the Libyan Conundrum. Victor, the floor is yours now.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is some technical issue. Okay, now I have the possibility to share my PPT and conquer the space from Omar. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I can share it. And now if everything is okay, you can see my PPT. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome for everybody. I got the honorable task to speak a little bit about the Libyan conundrum, and I put some addition to the title, from dictatorship to proxy war, because to sum up, actually we can be too optimistic about the development in Libya and this nation in North Africa, which went through 3 civil wars in the last years. Because time is running, I try to be quick and look fast. What are the main basic statements of my presentation? The first is that actually Libya and its political elites lost the momentum to rule their own country after this so-called Arab Spring. The second issue is that actually not only Libya and its elites, but also the EU and member states and Europe as a whole lost the momentum to rule its own strategic sphere of interest, which is very important. And unfortunately, it demonstrated well the lack of a coherent European approach towards Libya and the whole crisis in North Africa, in spite of, for example, the EU global strategy, and in spite of the efforts of the European External Action Service to put together a coherent EU approach towards the crisis. Just to mention the rivalry between France and Italy, but we can have mention a lot of other topics. And last but not least, it meant that foreign and sometimes even hostile actors quickly utilized the situation and filled the vacuum in Libya, which was, as I mentioned, also supported by the Libyan elites. And the consequences were still more or less is 3 civil, sometimes proxy wars in the country. Paradoxically, the infrastructural damages are limited, but in general, there are huge financial damages in general Libya, thanks to the fall of oil revenues and investments. And we can say that Libya wasted at least one, but perhaps more decades in the last years across what's happened in North Africa. Just some table about the worsening human development index positions or the fall of oil revenues in the country. So let's say some words about the Libyan elites. Actually, what we saw and still see in the country is a classic antithesis of fragile states, namely that the temptation of localness versus central government was actually too strong for Libyan actors. And after the fall of the regime, the fragile consensus collapsed between the different Libyan actors. In the last 10 years, academics and politicians tried to explain it with the dividers between East and West, you know, Tripolitan and Cyrenaica, North and South Fezzan and the rest, city versus city, I don't know, Misrata against Zintan, clans and tribes against other clans and tribes, militias and militias. But to tell you the truth, my impression is just a sugarcoat. Actually, what happened is selfishness was more important in the country. In the last 10 years, we see that different spoilers can very easily change their identity if it's necessary for them to get more revenues and more political power, which is very sad because actually the Libyan population know exactly what they want. It was researched in different surveys in 2016 and 2019, and Libyans want a potent central, sorry, not autonomy, but authority in the country. Actually, they want to get back their unified Libya. So actually the Libyan elites, had and have other ideas about the future of the country. And what we saw also that the elite always stepped against any potential powerful actor who started to emerge. It happened in just some months ago during the voting of Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, when actually, you know, the alliance of Fatih Bashaga and Aguila Saleh actually failed because they seemed a powerful actor. So most actors voted against them. Of course, because of also other different reasons, but it happened directly after the victory of the revolution, when the potent peoples of the National Transitional Council fall out very quickly from the political process. And what we see now, that it's a lack of hegemony in the country. It's not a new issue. In the last 10 years, we saw efforts to create hegemony. One of them was Haftar, which was, I think, a complete failure, but of course it's debatable. Actually, there are too many spoilers who don't have the capacity to build up a strong and united Libya, but has the capacity to jeopardize the state building procedure for unified Libya. And actually what is ongoing, it's a competition for power and resources, backed by the militias, and an openness for foreign involvement and patronage in this fight from different actors. Some words about the EU and Europe. It's very interesting to have a look at these map and tables. It came from the article was the paper from James Rogers. And it was written just before Arab Spring, at the end of 2010. And in this paper, James Rogers offered a more coherent grand strategy and a grand area for Europe and the European foreign and common foreign and security policy. And James Rogers offered that we should put together a grand area in which we should launch our foreign policy and security policy assets, including, I don't know, trade, military operations, etc., etc. And the offer of James Rogers was that actually at that time the EU acted in an ad hoc manner. Oh, there is some crisis, okay, we go there, but there is another crisis, then we won't go, etc., etc. So Rogers offered that we should put together a more coherent one, determining our grand area, our sphere of interest, and then if there is any problem there, we should go and stabilize the issue. Unfortunately, the situation currently and at the time of Arab Spring were much complicated because the crisis happened not in these areas, in the European, let's say, peripheries here, but actually in the European neighborhood. So it was a big failure, both for the member states and even the EU, and of course, other international actors like the United States, that even we were incapable to detect that something will happen in our close neighborhood. And currently still we are struggling to stabilize and contribute to the stabilization of our close neighborhood. And some words about the foreign influence, which shape this vacuum and fill this vacuum. We see many different reasons why foreign actors were fast to act in the European sphere of interest. Of course, it was economy in the case of Libya. It's very important to keep in our mind that Libya is a rich country with huge resources, huge foreign money reserves, and huge oil deposits, and a huge need for infrastructural projects for consumption. But we should mention also the case of smuggling, human trafficking, which also generate huge amount of money. We shouldn't forget that according to many reports, for example, Wagner Group is in Libya not only to participate in fights, but also to control smuggling networks there and generate revenue from the illicit activities. Of course, we should mention geopolitics, which has local and regional dimensions. First of all, Libya is the problem of its close neighbors. For Egypt, of course, on the other side, Tunisia, Algeria, and the other side of the Mediterranean, of course, Southern Europe. It's important to keep it also in our mind because it means that other actors can act here more independently. Because, well, frankly speaking, Russia or the United Arab Emirates is hardly affected by any negative consequences of the regional turmoil, which is caused by Libya. Contrary, for example, Italy or Egypt should be much more cautious and much more interested what's going on in their close neighborhood. We should mention this whole EastMed story. We don't have time to scrutinize it in details, but it should keep it in our mind that the Libyan crisis and the proxy wars and the involvement of Turkey and other actors also the part of this EastMed gas issue. And of course, we should keep in our mind that Libya not only a gate towards Europe, for example, the illegal migrants, but it's also a gate, for example, for Turkey toward the Sahel region. And in last year we see intention from Turkey to extend its bridgeheads toward sub-Saharan Africa. We should also emphasize the importance of ideology in this whole conflict. In one side, the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates and its enemies, which is strictly try to stop the influence of the group and its affiliate. And in this context, we see that in the last 2 years, mainly during the third civil war, the main actors in the country were Turkey in one side, supporting Faiz al-Sarraj and Tripoli and the GNA, and Russia on the other side, and of course the United Emirates, in the less extent Egypt, Italy, France, US, Sudan, Chad. The later ones mainly because the mercenaries, but of course there are other actors. So to say at least among these circumstances, it's very hard to find a consensus between the different actors. And what you see currently in the last half a year, it's back to not the start point, but let's say 2014, when Haftar emerged in the Libyan politics. Actually, we saw the emerge of government of national unity, which was fanfared by the international community as a big success. And of course, it's a big success because it signed the end of the third civil war. But as I mentioned during for example, the selection process of the members of the GNU, we have some, to say at least, we should be cautious whether how long these concepts will work in the country. Namely, because we should keep in our mind that according to the roadmaps, by the end of this year, let's say within 8 months, a general election should be organized in the country. And in the last 10 years, I forget to account that at least 5 times it was saying that there will be an election which will stop the whole transitional period in Libya. We haven't seen it. And what you can see now that foreign forces and mercenaries are still in the country. The weapons are there, weapons still flowing into the front lines from both sides, both for the, let's say, Western Libyan actors from Misrata and the previous Bunya Marsis operations forces, and both for Haftar forces. So actually, personally, I'm not too optimistic about how long this peace and stability will remain in the North African country. So thank you very much. And if you have any question, I will be ready to answer it for the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor, for your presentation. And that wraps up the presentational part of our first panel. And now we move on to the question and answers part. The first question is to Professor Troceni. The question is, which kind of long-term future do you see for the EU-Mediterranean partnership? Professor, your microphone is switched off.
Excuse me, can you repeat your question, because I was outside, pardon.
Of course, of course. Which kind of long-term future do you see for the EU-Mediterranean partnership?
I think for Europe, this partnership is crucial. It is very important. It is clear. The question is, what will be the different positions? As I mentioned, it is very important that Europe have to forget the teacher role. It is very important in my mind. When I speak with my friend in the different Arab countries, in the Maghreb countries, or the Mashrek countries, they want equal position when the discussion starts with the EU. In the European point of view, I think is very important also the stabilization. The stabilization, it means that we understood that we have to help to these countries, of course, and this is the reason that the European Union adopt in the budget the different amount to help to the Mediterranean parts. But as I mentioned also, it is very important for us to understand that when we speak the contact with the Mediterranean countries, we have to go further because there are the Sahel region also. And the Sahel region is very, very crucial. It means that the different countries, the Maghreb countries, had a bridge position. It means that for us, not only the Mediterranean, but Africa together. I think this is the big question, how the European Union will be able to create a contact with Africa, not only with the Maghreb countries or the Mashrek countries, because the question is more complicated. If there is a problem in the Sahel, is immediately there is an effect in the Maghreb countries. And this is the reason I think is very important to go further. And this is the big region, the Sahel, Maghreb, Mashrek, and Europe. I think today in Europe, there is the one point of view which is very important. This is the security aspect. But I think it's not enough, the security aspect. It's very important for Europe, of course, because the security of Europe is crucial. But on the other hand, if we would like to receive the security, in this case also we have to help to these countries to improve the economic situation and so on. It means that there are a lot of discussion today in Europe, in the European Parliament, how we have to, how can I say in English, how we can be able to create a better cooperation with this region of the world.
Thank you, Professor, for your detailed answer. Now our second question is for Professor Gamal Selim. The question is the importance of Africa increasing in Egyptian foreign policy?
Yes, definitely. Africa now is gaining its importance on the agenda of Egyptian foreign policy after 2013, after almost 3 decades of neglect, unfortunately, under President Mubarak. So Egypt has recently realized that its African connections are indispensable to its national security. And in fact, the water security of Egypt now is clearly connected with this African dimension. The current crisis with Ethiopia over the Renaissance Dam and how this crisis is posing a threat to Egypt's national security. Actually, this means that Africa cannot be neglected anymore. And this is one of the the portfolios that Egypt has been focusing on over the last 5 or 6 years, how to reconnect again with Africa at the formal and civil society level as well, through development aid, through joint projects with different African nations, and through cultural exchanges as well. So I think like Africa now is coming back, and we will see that Africa will be much more important even to Egypt in the coming few years. And hopefully the African Union, with its current role as the mediator in the Sudanese, Egyptian, Ethiopian negotiations, hopefully the African Union could provide some credible mediation assistance to the 3 parties in order to overcome the current crisis.
Thank you for your answer. Unfortunately, because of our strict schedule, we don't have time for any more questions. I would like to thank our presenters of the first panel, especially the external ones, Professor Nadmi Roja and Professor Gamal Selim, and especially Professor Trochani for providing a keynote address to our conference. Now we are going to have a coffee break up until 3:45. So we will reconvene in exactly 16 minutes.
This session will be chaired by myself. And without much further ado, I would like to call on a highly esteemed friend and colleague, Professor László Csicsman from the Corvinus University, to start his presentation under the title, A Second Wave of the Arab Protests, Similarities and Differences. Is there an Arab Spring 2.0? László, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, and let me share my presentation with you. And I'm ready to start the presentation. First of all, I'm very grateful to the organizers for having me invited and for organizing this timely conference on the Arab Spring. And I have to say that a lot of things have been raised by the previous speakers, but I would like to focus more on the more recent development since 2019. There's a quite easy answer to my question. Is the Arab Spring 2.0? I don't believe in that. It's part of the same political transformation process which has started a decade or even more than a decade ago, which it was presented by the previous speaker, the roots of the Arab protest. As a political scientist and scholar of international relations, I always try to building on the existing theories of political science and international relations. And relating to the political transformation process in the Middle East and North Africa, we have basically two competing theories. Of course, we have many theories, but we have two much more fundamental theories. The one is the so-called democratization discourse, which was emerged during the end of the Cold War, when there was a successful and very rapid democratization process in the Central Eastern European region, as well as in many Latin American countries previously. As Samuel P. Huntington mentioned in his book, this is part of the third wave of worldwide democratization process, and there are discussions about the potential fourth wave of democratization process. However, since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, only one country had a successful democratization process, which is Tunisia, which is, according even to the Freedom House, belongs now to the so-called free countries according to the political system. However, if we get into deeply in the Tunisian political system, we realize that procedurally, of course, the Tunisian political system is a democracy. However, substantially speaking, we see a reproduction of the old elites, which we cannot refer to Tunisia as a consolidated type of democracy. And we have the so-called post-democratization discourse, which emerged especially during the 90s, when the scholars of international relations and political science realized that there is a kind of exception in the Middle East. It was widely seen by the experts that the Middle East is a kind of exception of the so-called worldwide democratization process, and especially it was described as an authoritarian stability and authoritarian resilience, which means that those authoritarian regimes are resilient to transformation and to large wave of protest, and there is a kind of authoritarian upgrading, and even there was a discussion, and still there is a discussion about the role of monarchies, whether the monarchies are more stable than the republics, and that kind of things. We have to say that neither theories could explain what's going on in the Middle East. This is one of our problems as political scientists. As one of my colleagues even said that the Middle East is a kind of symmetry of the theories of political science, so that's not easy to refer. I would call the Arab Spring as a political transformation process which is going on, in which a new type of authoritarian systems emerge. Let them call us now authoritarian regimes, and unfortunately it's not about the fourth wave of democratization. In this political transformation process, we have to say that regime times are very important. This is a kind of course, a simplification. As always in political science, to understand the things, we should simplify the issues. However, if we use these two variables, we see the role of France and the type of system, which here we have the hereditary and the non-hereditary systems, the monarchies and the republics, and the rentier states and the non-rentier states. when we are speaking about the first wave of protest in 2011, it was basically in the republics, the non-rentier republics. So it's Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Syria. So we see that these countries or these regimes are politically less stable than the others. However, during the second wave of the Arab protest in 2019, we even see some rentier states are not that stable. Just think about the case of Algeria and the case of Iraq, which is of course a kind of special case, as it was referred by Professor Erzsébet, that Iraq is a continuous crisis, we have to say, and not to forget that Libya is here in this group. We started the political transformation in 2011. But it is very important to mention that it seems that the monarchies are more stable than the republics. However, I would say that even monarchies are not seen as an exemption of the political transformation process. Just think about the case of Jordan and Morocco, and especially in Jordan, there are a lot of ongoing things and troubles in the political system. So especially that type of political systems, we see a constant reform process. And even in the rentier monarchies, the so-called oil monarchies, in the GCC region, we see a process of diversification, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Oman. We have different visions for the future, which is about somehow stabilize and the monarchies, and especially to prevent any political turmoil in that part of the region. Let me continue with some general features of the protest wave 2019, which is, of course, it has the similarities with the first wave of protest in 2011, but we have to say that it's much more embedded in a global wave of protest. Just think about the case of Hong Kong, France, Chile, or Bolivia, or we can mention many countries in the world. We see a kind of anti-elitist movement, especially started in the cities, youth generation, and the socio-economic problems play an important role in organizing those processes. So when we are speaking about the protest in Lebanon or the protest in Algeria, this is somehow part of this global wave of protest. Even they learn each other, they communicate through the international media, with the social media tools, how to organize protests. So even I saw it myself that these are ongoing communication. Very important to mention the role of adaptive authoritarianism, which term used first by Stephen Heidemann, a very important scholar on the Middle East. He wrote about that the contemporary authoritarian regimes learn from each other how to deal with the protest. So when we are speaking about Algeria or the Sudanese events or the Lebanese events, we must know that there were some previous experience, of course, in Libya, Syria, and other countries, and the ruling elite is learning from each other how to deal with the protesters. And of course, even the protesters learn from each other. So the Algerian look at the Egyptian case and many other cases. So that kind of demonstration factors play an important role in the second wave. We can ask the question, why 2019? And I think one of the answers is the following. We see a kind of previous experience with violence in those countries, especially this is the case with Algeria, with Lebanon, with the case of Iraq, and with the case of Sudan. In the four countries, we've seen a previous wave of civil war. Just think about the Algeria in the 90s, or just think about the Northern Sudan divide in the case of Sudan, or just think about the Lebanese civil war, which emerged in 1975. So for this reason, these countries try to prevent somehow the wave of protest in 2090s, and not only the regime, but we have to say that the society was very careful with start of a kind of political demonstrations. So these are, I think, very important facts. Of course, these are heterogeneous societies with economic difficulties. This is nothing new because most of the Middle Eastern states are heterogeneous societies with economic difficulties. However, why in 2090s? Because I mentioned the case of Algeria, which is a rentier state, which is considered as a rentier state. We see in 2011 and after that, a kind of positive contribution by the ruling regime, especially in socio-economic factors. They try to silence somehow the society, because with the rent it was managed, I mean, not well, but I have to say there was an opportunity to increase some kind of socio-economic budget. But after a while, especially the recent years, there was a huge problem, of course, with the rent, the decrease of the oil prices, and a lot of things, spillover effects, which played an important role in the state budget. I think it's a general feature of the protest. We see a kind of hostility against the role of foreign countries and foreign intervention. Just think about the case of Iraq, where a year ago in 2020, the Iraqi parliament has adopted a non-binding resolution saying that all foreign troops should leave the country. So in many countries, the society sees the role of foreign, whether it's a regional like Iran or global countries like the United States. Many times it is seen that they use as a kind of battleground or playground, especially in the case of Iraq. So there is a kind of protest wave which is very much included the role of foreign actors. General feature of the protest wave in 2019 that it seems that the whole society united. We are Sudanese, and it's not about sectarian division as it was previously. Like in the case of Sudan, there are a lot of issues with Darfur, or in Algeria, the minority, or just think about the Lebanese society. So it seems there is a rise of modern nationalism in those countries. However, if we see the protesters, they many times protest separately from each other. The Shias protest in the Shia districts, and they never united in a place. And we see a rise of importance of functional horizontal issues, like the climate change matters, or in the case of Lebanon, is the garbage crisis. In Iraq, it's the climate change is important, and the lack of electricity is important, the lack of water. So that kind of issues are important in the protest. And we see 4 countries where the protests had an impact on the executive power: is Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon, which means that not only 4 countries involved in the second wave of protests, but more than 10 countries involved among the 22 Arab states. But however, I chose 4 countries which are more important because the executive power somehow impacted by the protests. These are Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan. And you can clearly see the differences among those countries. I mean, of course, there are many similarities, but we see differences like the size of the population. Lebanon is a small country, but Sudan, Algeria, and Iraq have a larger population. The poverty rate Sudan is much higher than unemployment is high, and of course the methodology are very important issue. So we see many differences in those countries, which means there is not only one factor which can describe, or which can help us to describe what's going on in those countries. And what kind of political transformation and transition is going on? It usually depends on, according to the literature of political science, on internal and external factors. And according to the literature of political science, which I try to build my presentation on, is the internal factors are more important than the external factors. But of course, with the rapid globalization process that's going on and the role of social media, there is an increase of the role of external factors in political transformation, which is of course true for the Middle Eastern region, which is regarded as a penetrated region according to the literature. But when we are speaking about the internal factors, a kind of path dependency should be highlighted, which means that the previous institutionalization of the regime plays an important role in the way of political transformation. And from this point, we see a different type of transformation process in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Of course, what is very important according to the literature of political science is the power relation between the opposition groups and the ruling elite. And here the Egyptian experience again play a very important role, especially the fact that in 2013, Mohamed Morsi, the elected leader, was removed by the military. And especially the case of Algeria and especially the case of Sudan is very important because these countries are regarded by military dominated countries in which the military play a very important role, which is not that much in the case of Lebanon, and in Iraq it has a different role of the military. So in Sudan, today we see a negotiated transformation. In Algeria, it's a bit different one, but it's always depending on this power relation. And of course, the external factors, this is my last slide, so I'm going to conclude within 1 minute. The role of external factors play a very important role. I mentioned that, especially the Iraqi case, it's like a playground of the global and regional countries. It's very important to mention that we have the state and non-state actors. We have the question is the regional order. Professor Erzsébet already discussed this, and we have the global powers competition in the Middle East. And we have to say that this whole thing is under transformation. So not only the internal factors and the political system itself are under transformation. However, the external factors are under transformation. Just think about the kind of withdrawal of the United States from the region. And it seems that the vacuum much more filled by, hopefully, the European Union, but China, of course, and Russia playing an important role. The regional order are very important, and of course, state and non-state actors. And they shaping, of course, the way of political transformation in the region. So let me conclude with the sentence that there is no Arab Spring 2.0. I would like to use Arab Spring more as a working title. I would say instead a political transformation process which started more than a decade ago. And the second wave of the protest, part of the same political transformation, because Erzsébet has raised the question whether it's the beginning or the end. So it's still ongoing transformation. And of course, the end of this transformation depends on a lot of things. Thank you for your attention, and let me stop my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, László, Professor Csicsman, for this kind of introduction to the next case studies. And let me call on Professor Annette Weber from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, where she's a senior researcher, to go on. Sudan has been mentioned quite a while, and we are listening to you, Annette, to give us a deeper insight. Thank you. Annette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erzsébet. And maybe 2 points before I start. Thank you for the professorship, which in real life I have not yet gained. So that's one point. And the second point is, and it was mentioned, in basically all inputs so far, Arab world, the Arab Spring. I think I would like to start my case study on Sudan with actually the identity of the Sudanese protesters at the beginning, very, very much referring their transition, their protests to the protests in Ethiopia. And distancing themselves from the Arab Spring. They didn't see themselves as part of the legacy of the Arab Spring. And I think this is extremely important if we look at the question of the protest, if we look at the composition of the protesters, if we look at the factors of why Sudan was so far successful, but also if we look at where are we now and what does it mean for the Sudanese transition, that the Ethiopian example did not at the moment work out so well. So these are, that's my beginning. And I would like to start really with the composition of the protesters. And I think, we've heard it on various examples from that wave and the other wave, very similar to many other countries. Of course, we had, protests in '64, we had protests in '85. But this time, I think there were a number of differences that were quite fundamental to the success. One is the variety, the breadth of protesters. We had the protest didn't start in Khartoum and it didn't stay in Khartoum. So the protest started in Atbara. So it was, yes, very much a protest from all smaller and larger cities, but the communication between the cities was always an ongoing communication. You had protests where the people from Atbara came by the trains run by the union, by the train union, run by the train union with thousands of protesters coming from the different locations to Khartoum or coming from Khartoum to other different locations. So the composition in terms of it wasn't only rural, it wasn't only a central protest, whereas Sudan for the last decades was always run as a very centralist state with satellites given to basically to militias to control. But this, for the first time, really the various sectors of the marginalized regions of Sudan came together and communicated these protests. So that's one. The composition of the protests, I think, is really fundamental for this change. Because yes, it was driven very much by young people, by young activists, by young women. But it was also driven by professionals and by the unions. Professionals, the doctors, the nurses, the lecturers, the teachers. You had all the various professional groups organizing the protest. And I think this was important for this change in Sudan because it was a leaderless movement, if you look at it in the large scale. But the mobilization was very much done by the different professional groups. So the doctors would call for a specific protest at a specific day, mobilizing via WhatsApp, via Telegram, via internet, via the media, to go to a protest without a leader, one leader speaking there. The spokesperson at the protest, whereas you see, you remember the famous example of the leading women in the protest. So basically, those who spoke at the protests spoke spontaneously. It wasn't organized that there is the leader of the protest. And I think this reflection is really, it was a very, very new reflection. And it was, I think, going a couple of steps ahead of what we've seen the year before, the 2 years before in Ethiopia, because the protests in Ethiopia were basically run by young men who went to the streets and who called for Abiy Ahmed and who called for the old regime to fall. That was not the case in Sudan. It was much larger. The society was basically all there on the streets. There was a difference between day and evening and night. During the daytime, it was women, it was elderly women, children even, who went to the protest, and at night it was younger men. But the agreement after the first protest starting in Atbara, where Molotov cocktails were thrown, the agreement amongst the protesters, again driven by the professionals, was let's stay nonviolent. Let's not be provoked by the militias, by the intelligence, by the military. So I think that was also extremely important. I remember being in Khartoum and speaking to the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he said, look, I mean, my mother is going to the protests without asking my permission. My wife is going to the protests without asking my permission. Do you think I can, as the former, foreign minister, do you think I have authority to call on these people to stay back? I don't. And this is exactly what also the military is facing. Nobody can go out and shoot during the day I mean, basically they're shooting their wives and their mothers, and that's impossible for us to do. And I think this is the second point of the composition, because of course in the beginning everybody wasn't sure, nobody was really sure, how will the military swing? It was clear the intelligence will remain with Bashir. It was important that the military decided step by step, and again, it's not unlike other transitions or other protests, the military decided to stay on the side of the protesters. You might remember the 3rd of June massacres where the RSF, most likely the RSF, started to shoot at the peaceful protest. The military decided to basically shoot back against their own militias and siding with the protesters. So you had basically the protest in front of the military barracks, the people were shot at, and those inside of the military barracks shot again and against the RSF. And I think that was the third important factor that we've seen in the case of Sudan, the RSF, the military, the militia, the biggest militia that we have in the region, led by a former Janjaweed, Hameti. And why is the RSF so important? The RSF is basically stronger, much better trained, economically independent, and led by a charismatic leader. So you had a militia trained and engaged in the GCC conflict on the GCC side in the Yemen war. 16,000 RSF and the circulation. It's not only 16,000; it was 16,000 on the ground. So there were more coming in and going, who were basically there outside of the control of the Sudanese army, but controlled and chain of command was directly to Hameti. Hameti took these young boys from Darfur, from the two areas, to Yemen, and the money that they got paid was directly paid to their parents. So the connection to Hameti was extremely strong. The loyalty to Hameti was extremely strong. He was independent in terms of means, so he could provide salary to his militia, unlike the army sometimes. He was independent in terms of means because he was, was running basically the gold business and other smuggling businesses. So he was a real threat to the old regime. Once Hameti decided that he is basically cutting his link to his former boss, Bashir, but that he saw himself as being actually not only the driver or the transition belt for this transition, but imagined himself as basically somebody who would come out of this transition as a potential, leader, president, whatever. I think this is when this balance of power, and Laszlo said it before, when Bashir fell after 5 months, and when the balance of power shifted to a negotiated power arrangement between the civilians. And the civilians were those who were on the street, who were protesting before. The civilians were those from the traditional parties, including those from the Ba'ath Party and the Communist Party. Actually, the Communist Party becoming becoming strong again after sleeping for the last 30 years. They got invigorated. And you had this mix of civilians who needed to negotiate their path, and you had basically the balance of power with the militias and the army. And why is it holding so far? Because it's beneficial to all of them. It's beneficial to all of them, at least so far, out of several reasons. Without the civilians, only the civilians could unlock the big question of delisting Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list in the US. That was not possible for the military. That would have never been possible for a former Janjaweed leader like Hameti. So that was definitely a precondition for an economic change, because of course the protests started originally as bread protests. The bread prices were increased, like in 85, like in 64. It was an intifada based on bread prices. So the economy, of course, became extremely important. Only the civilians could do the delisting, and they have managed to do that. Only the civilians could negotiate now further, you know, with the European Union led by Germany, with the Friends of Sudan group, where they had the first donor meeting last year with enormous pledges. Only the civilians could negotiate an access to international financial institutions, an unlocking of debt by the Paris Club. Only, you know, these extremely fast steps that we've seen since the revolution could have only been done by the civilians. On the other hand, the army and the militia basically guaranteed that the Gulf states didn't come in to topple one side or the other, because Hemeti, through his engagement in Libya, he's also engaged in Libya, but he made his money in Yemen. Hemeti, through his engagement, was becoming much closer to the Gulf states, whereas Burhan, as the leader of the army, of course, you know, I mean, he did what Bashir has always done very successfully. He was good with juggling Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, as well as the Gulf states. So this internal balance in the armed forces was providing, or is still providing, this kind of, well, balanced approach that we see so far. Will it be holding? I think that, of course, is a big question. What we see right now is, of course, that there is a debate on not only the social contract inside, but also the nature of the state. And I think this is where it's really profoundly different to what we've seen in Ethiopia. The nature of the state in Sudan is not just the question of, you know, letting South Sudan go with all the resources and letting basically half of the country disappear. The nature of the state is also, what do we mean by center periphery? And I think when we look at the new composition of the new cabinet, that is where the nature of the state is newly negotiated. We have a cabinet, I mean, the former cabinet of the transition was a technocrat cabinet. I think that was the right move. You know, Prime Minister Abdul Hamdok being somebody who served for the UN in economic positions throughout his career. That's quite, you know, not a political driven cabinet. They are not politicians. They were not politicians. Now the new cabinet from earlier this year is a political cabinet. It might be weaker in the moment in terms of topical expertise, but it's a cabinet that really is not only from all different corners of the country, but also encompasses all of the different segments and sectors of the, let's say, the old political parties, the new Protestants, I mean, the traditional political parties, and I think that's my last point before I go to you know, what can we see in the future, and including now the former armed opposition. So all the Darfur oppositions, the two areas of opposition, the SPLM North -2, who are still negotiating, are now part of the government. So basically, this government is really coming together. We have the finance minister who was the leader of Chen, you know, and we see how things are going now that Debbie has been killed, and you know what kind of pathways to the Sahel or to Libya this will be opening. But right now, the transitional government is really encompassing basically everybody, including the Islamists, but the Islamists in a new form, the Islamists in the form of the former armed opposition, the Islamists in the form of people like, you know, the leader of Jem or some of the Mini Minawi people. So it's basically those from the peripheries coming in as representative of a new generation of Islamists, and not being basically the old elite, not being the old elite coming back to their old powers. Of course, the old elite is still there. I mean, you know, you don't run a country for 30 years and just disappear. And we've seen that in the last 2 years, of course, with, you know, acts of sabotage, the question of money disappearing, the question of government contracts. And this is, of course, definitely going to take much longer to clear out. But I think this is what I described as the balance, the benefit for the army and the armed forces and the civilians and having all these aspects really reflected, I think there is a chance for Sudan to continue on that path. If the end of the path is really, you know, if they will decide on becoming a liberal democracy, maybe very unlikely. If they slide back into an authoritarian regime, not if the composition holds as it is, because that is of nobody's interest. And I think this is, you know, also where the balance inside is reflective of the balance outside, because of the negotiations between, you know, the transatlantic EU-American negotiations, pushing very hard for the Sudanese transition, but also the negotiations between that group and the Gulf states, being cognizant that without the Gulf states, you cannot fight them in Sudan. So find the common interest, and the common interest is, you know, stability and bringing the economy back. The where we definitely have no common interest is, you know, is what kind of stability, and can stability only be provided by the military? But so far, the Gulf states are in accordance with everybody else, and I think that is at least providing some optimism for me. And I leave it here. There is much more to discuss. Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, Annette. This was very, very interesting. We do not hear much about Sudan, either nowadays or a few years back. So it was extremely interesting for me, from my perspective, and I hope for the others as well. And now I would like to turn to my very kind, very old friend, accomplice in many issues, Walter Posch, who works at the National Defense Academy in Vienna, Wien. He's a senior researcher, but he's also teaching at time and again. So Walter, the floor is yours. You are going to speak about Iraq, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be back to Budapest, even if it's only virtually. And it's a great pleasure for me to meet a non-aging good colleague of mine, Annette Weber from Berlin, which we spent 5 years together. And I really miss our exchanges about social movements very, very much. This is, I tried to reassemble a little bit my argument to begin with. Yes, Arab Spring 2.0, no, not in Iraq, winter is coming. The reasons are manifold, and I try to break them down a little bit with sociological and other arguments and political arguments, but especially I will focus on the security sector reform for reasons I will give immediately. To begin with, the easiest, but not entirely correct, but the easiest way to approach to leave the cliches about Iraq behind and to break it down only to ethno-religious elements and chunks or to tribes is to look at the power of influential families who just have a say and to perceive the country and the country's political and economic space as the place of powerful families and clans who just run it, and you cannot debate their power. This would help you to explain why certain Arab families are, even if they're not ministers, still influential, and why certain Kurdish families, even when they go into politics, into electoral politics, simply cannot be kicked out of office. You would annoy a whole entourage, and stability would be seriously hampered. Hence, democracy, electoral democracy, is very often based on the principle one time, one vote, but also one group and one family. This is especially true for Kurdistan. For the rest of Iraq, where we have much more insecurity and much bigger dynamics, I would argue that a lot of people who think we're stakeholders who would like to push into politics just have not found the equilibrium with others. Now, this is the first layer. Now, how does such a political family work? I looked into several ones and found striking features of similarities, whether they are Shiite politicians or tribesmen or Kurdish politicians. Those who really wield influence usually have a political machine, let's call it a political party, a militia of sorts. Whether this was really a party militia or a tribal militia or something totally different doesn't matter. And this militia is double-headed, as a militia being transformed into one part of the security services, or as a criminal organization, or in some cases as both. This is a toxic heritage also from the Saddam Hussein years. Let's have a look back. The border control, the border guards of Saddam Hussein were not part of the Interior Ministry. They were part of the Revolutionary Command Council. Why? Because very easy, smuggling and smuggling income would go to the Revolutionary Command Council / the right people in the right places, mostly friends and families. So a similar border arrangement model one can see on certain points in Turkey and throughout the Rojava region in Syria. So this border smuggling issue and the part of integrated smuggling as part of regime stabilization and income generation is rather normal. It also has, especially when it comes to the touchy issue of the Kurds, an ideological side on it. Having said this, what is even worse is that the Iraqi armed forces have also always had a very sordid tradition of being used against their own population. Now, speaking from the place where I am and remembering our own laws, which are very similar, I don't want to speak out too critically about it, but a fact is when you train from the previous regime whole units to suppress parts of the population, and you start a new start, and people realize that both in the Kurdish area and in the central government area, counterinsurgency, suppression of uprisings, even breaking strikes is part of the curriculum of certain police and special police forces. The trust from the general trust from the population towards these units will certainly diminish. Ironically, well, let's the irony aside. But this is the overall relationship from the state and its autonomous entity to the ordinary population. However, as we all know, identities plays an incredibly important role in Iraq. Whatever identity is, it is labeled as Kurdish, it is labeled as Shiite, it is labeled as Sunni. If we then take into consideration that with the end of Saddam, with the last years of Saddam Hussein, after the Iran-Iraq war and the sanctions, Iraqi society had been accustomed to be part of a distribution system which enforces patronage and clientelist distribution of goods, but also financial means or access to higher education and healthcare. Then we and we know this is now the third generation of Iraqis. If we add to this that part of the new elites of Iraq have been trained in Iran under similar circumstances, always been grateful for what in this case, the Iranian government gives you and how they donate to you, which is connected to ideological well-being and usefulness. What do you expect when these people come back to Iraq, or when the previous regime is left and the new one comes there? What people think they can await from a state? Well, their demands are the same quasi-welfare / control state demands as has been previously by the Saddam Hussein regime. And the gold coin of employment and of wealth are actually only three. One is oil and gas income, hydrocarbon income, and whatever could spin off. So with all these manufacturers and parties, it turned out what was to be feared, that each group tries to jockey about income from the oil ministry and to distribute it. To the great credit, the Iraqis done a quite decent deal with the possibilities at the ground they have to generate wealth for at least to be able to pay the salaries. But just one example shows how complicated this is. When you take the famous 2007 Charge of the Nights military operation conducted by the Iraqi police with the Americans against the smuggling rings of Basra. Well, you also can have a second look at it and say, well, this was the Badr Corps, the formerly trained Iranian Iraqis in Iraqi police uniform, aided by the Americans, to go against their Shiite competitors of the Fadila, who had not the luck to put their militiamen into some kind of official guard and getting money for them. However, these guys were controlling the oil terminals in Basra. So you see immediately a question which is actually a question of management and managing the oil wealth turning out to be translated into a security question, breaking down to a militia strife, which actually is like gang warfare between two. There was no ideological interference or so between these two groups. They just don't like each other, both Shiites and so on. With this kind of general setup, you can imagine how difficult it is to reform the rest. And this brings me to the second point. The next biggest income for an ordinary Iraqi to generate is to join one of the armed forces, be they police force, be they certain militias. Whether these militias are legal or illegal is not so much of importance when you have to feed a family and when you think you have to secure your incomes, and or one of the many Western security firms which provided security. But basically what you do is soldiering on whatever level it is and with whatever enthusiasm. Now, combine this with traditional or in some cases recent, with the tradition of a popular view on the legality of bearing arms in certain areas, tribal areas mostly. You may end up with all these double realities, that part of your tribal unit entity is part of the police, the other ones are somewhere in the underground, but the main motive why people would go there or there would be of economic in nature. This said, the third element, of course, is smuggling, be it smuggling in drugs, both inside and outside Iraq, or be it human trafficking. And here again, those groups on the borders are better off, mostly the Kurds, be it the PKK, be it the KDP, or who else, for the simple reason that the border to Turkey, the way via Turkey, is much more attractive for almost everyone, because once in Turkey, you're in Istanbul and the Balkans are nearby. So outside of these three fields, the whole state apparatus consists of public and the whole public and the public servants are the only ones who can additionally get a reasonable job. Economy is down, agriculture is down, production is down, and most politicians still have this double-headedness as head of militias and being politicians, fearing that this term could be their last term and behaving accordingly. This said, the security sector reform and the functioning of certain military units is quite interesting. for instance, the fight against the Islamic State, or several other counter-terror operations are, if we only take the military and the intelligence side of it, very professional. Trained, often inherited the old Iraqi systems, sometimes also including training from the Iranians, but mostly from the most finest Western special forces from the US, British, and so on. Over this, we have to put another layer, and that is a triangular confrontation, which we can call the Iraqi outside forces. There are two circles of these outside forces. One is the intransigencies of the Kurdish scene, where I simply rest my case with the argument that the Kurdistan regional government, as long as it is dominated by the KDP, will always be grudgingly, but it will always be pro-Turkey and anti-PKK. Will always be. And this affects the whole setup of Kurdish politics up to Europe, where you're standing. So both sides in Syria and in Iraq, the KDP and the PKK, call all the heroism the Kurds, but basically they run their own civil war, knowingly very well aware of the fact that the Kurdish Islamists have not joined the game yet. On the Iraqi level, on the national Iraqi level, the thing is a little bit more frightening. When the US decided to intervene in the region, they immediately came into a triangular situation, which is confronting Iran for ideological and religious or ideological reasons and so on. Mustering therefore the support of Arab nation states using the Shia-Sunni divide and so on, but also as an independent actor, what we can call Al-Qaeda plus. It was originally Al-Qaeda, it was then becoming Islamic State and so on. Whatever this political current is, fiercely anti-Iranian, strangely connected to Arab powers, but acting independently from them and not being controllable by them. And when we saw in the last years the wish of the Iraqis that the US might leave, but leave a stable Iraq behind, which is kind of contradictory, we would know that on one hand, they know very well that they have to find an agreement, an understanding with the new Sunni insurgency, with the Sunnis in general, and the core question, if we reduce it to inner Iraqi affairs, is on which condition and what are the conditions where Iraqi Sunnis and the majority in parliament would find their agreement. Strangely enough, the leadership of the Ba'ath Party, they kind of found their own way in the Iraqi society, and with some exceptions, with some very broadcasted exceptions, are still holding important positions. So I was surprised in Iraq to see the old Iraq, all the Saddam Hussein lookalikes sitting in ministries, running actually the show, administering, and being obviously everything but Shiite and everything but Shiite revolutionary, and having a new ethos, namely the ethos of a secular Iraqi state. I don't want to overstate their potential, but just state that we should not underestimate and ignore it, and confine them to a simplistic reading that they are just Ba'athist and therefore followers of Saddam Hussein, especially the younger ones are most likely not even Ba'athist. There is, on the positive side, a new bureaucracy evolving, a new professional bureaucracy evolving. And the big tragedy is, especially when it comes to the fact that we have a total compartmentalized security setup. Defense ministry has a part, Interior Ministry has almost the same amount of firepower, but definitely a lot of, when it comes to special forces, more trained and more experienced troops with special units at the direct disposal of the Interior Ministry. The Prime Minister has his own troops with the General Security Service, plus he oversees also the pupils' mobilization units. And I would like to come here, close it here, because this could involve Europe. The popular mobilization units are not always all Shiites, although most of them are. Part of them have big roots in the resistance against Saddam Hussein. Part of them have been in the Iran-Iraq war on the Iranian side because they've been prisoners of war. And they've been put together with the ideologues who formed, who were used especially for behind the scenes, behind the lines operations and so on. This was especially the Badr Corps. These, I don't want to run it down, but 1 minute, I finish.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
The Iranian influence on these groups has decreased over the last years, but there is still some. It is not meaning that it's zero, but it has dramatically decreased. And the majority of the fighting forces, not of the experienced cadres, are followers of Ayatollah Sistani. Furthermore, what the Iraqis did was to count them, to give them regiment numbers, to identify the heavy arms, to put them in a chain of command so that we at least know who they are. And they promulgated a law where they said, in this, following to this law, when you fight in Syria under a different command, under a different flag, you are not entitled for Iraqi retirement benefits and Iraqi salary. These are important steps. No one else but themselves can put some kind of order into this militia chaos. The tendency is now to see it, be it with Operation Inherent Resolve, be it with the NATO and the EU missions, to reduce all the problems of Iraq to the influence of the Iranian side and these militias, and therefore with goodwill undo what has already been done on getting them under control, or put a certain modicum of control over them, because it's better to have an Iraqi control over them than a European or an American control, which never will happen. So if for the Europeans now it is to decide or to see clearly that supporting a security sector reform in Iraq is not to come with our own ideas. We may share experience from Bosnia or from the Balkan wars. That's the maximum, I would say. But to support an ongoing patient Iraqi process, which has at a certain point to be supported by a political dialogue within all Iraqi factions. What we are doing is not this. I see already that we reduce this to the simplistic way. There is US intervention or Western intervention. We help the Iraqis and the Iranian meddling. This will not help us anywhere. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Walter. I'm sorry that I have to disrupt you, but these are very, very interesting topics. Without further ado, I would like to call on, last but not least, my friend, Professor Yahya Zubir. Yahya, ahlan bik, who is a professor at the Catch Business School, a senior lecturer, and he will tell us all about Algeria. Yahya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I have to apologize. I'm working on 2 devices and I cannot post my slides because they're doing some electrical, repairs, and I keep losing power. So I have the 4G next to me in case. So I'll be able to present without the slides. Dealing with Algeria is probably one of the most complicated, in the sense that the political system has been quite resilient, because it's been in existence since the country's independence, or it was even designed just before the independence. And contrary to the countries that you have covered so far, and I heard some references to Algeria as well, Algeria eluded the Arab Spring in the sense that there are different reasons for that, because Algeria had a sort of, I hate the term spring, but just for the purpose of the conference. But it had its Arab Spring in 1988. That was one of the most, it was a truly dramatic, I mean, it was the most optimistic. At the time, we all had some optimism about Algeria, like we did about Tunisia. And, you know, we still have some issues in Tunisia as well. But the country went through a traumatic period in the 90s. And because of that traumatic period, there was no spillover from the neighborhood, from Libya or Tunisia or elsewhere. But also, and we can come back to that later, because the country benefited from a big rent. The oil revenues were high, and the regime was able to co-opt civil society and what have you. My depiction of Algeria has been, you know, that it has, it is a protracted transition. It's a transition that keeps going on, and when you go to the bottom of it, the regime has been very astute. It has a toolkit in terms of, you know, how to rejuvenate by making enough changes to give the impression that change is occurring, when in fact the political system is the same, the political discourse is almost the same, you know, the narrative is the same. And why I like to talk about the old political system, because you know, it rests on a tripartite foundation. That is the military, the one party, the one that stayed in, now it's part of a multi-party system, but it is the one with the closest network, clientelism, patronage, and so on and so forth, and the high administration. And so this rejuvenating itself did not, you know, faced a very serious problem in the last years of the Bouteflika rule. You know, that Bouteflika ruled for about 20 years, actually, exactly 20 years. And so, but again, his own rule, rested on this dependence on hydrocarbons. It was pretty high. And what you see is, starting in 2014, when the price of oil was going, if you allow me, I backtrack to 1986. 1986, the prices of oil went down. You had in 1988, you have a major uprising, okay, with all the consequences. You come back to this more recent period, and the prices of oil started going down in 2014, but the country was still, that there was wealth, there was, you know, a social system that keeps things going. But then the crisis was ongoing, and you had a president who was a zombie, basically. You know, he was all but dead. And you have this, the governance was appalling, corruption at a peak. The country was going, basically you had two directions. You have a strong presidency with its entourage, you know, corrupt and dilapidating, you know, the resources of the country. There were the emergence of a group called the Algerians called it the oligarchs, involved in construction and so on and so forth, but all based on a corrupt system. So this will bring me, because I know that you gave me a limited time, but the regime or the political system has always claimed to rest on or to represent this legacy of the Algerian War of Liberation, and that was basically the foundation of its legitimacy. But it lost it, and it still is clinging to it. There's they talk about this revolutionary family and so on. The ones who made the war. So you have it's reminiscent of what happened in the Soviet Union when they had to give them some special shots to keep them awake. These are people very old, an old guard that is still in power, and an emerging society, a very youthful society emerging. So as long as the system can co-opt, there is a sort of stability, and then problems emerge. So what happened, and this brings me to you guys call it Arab Spring 2 or whatever. For me, there is no such a thing. I see a continuity. There's a system, and thank you for raising, I forgot, who was it? Was it you, Elizabeth, talking about neo-patrimonialism and so on. So I don't need to go back to the theories and all this stuff, but you have a president who is basically half dead and is entourage, that has so many interests, wants that system to remain in place for another term. I mean, the guy who could not even campaign for himself had people campaigning on his behalf. So if anyone in the room or in the audience knows about the Algerian DNA is that you have to always be careful of Algerians. Their being quiet does not mean they're acquiescent of whatever is going on. So it was like a pressure cooker. It was building up. And then when he announced that he was going to run again for a fifth term, that caused the explosion. But what is absolutely unique about what has happened in Algeria is that the movement was totally peaceful. It has. I went there. I was there before the pandemic. In fact, I was there even just before the pandemic hit Algeria. This was last year in March, and everybody was stunned by the organization, by the slogans and what have you. What is amazing is that the people, civil society, reacquired that legitimacy of the Algerian War. You will see pictures of the old revolutionaries, the ones who died, by the way, not the ones who are alive, but the ones who died, who gave themselves, to Algeria and so on and so forth, and accusing the regime of having stolen, in fact, the war, of having deviated from, the path of the revolution. That is, because when they proclaimed the war against France on November 1st, 1954, the motto was, we want an free, an independent Algeria, democratic, social, and so on and so forth. And so the movement turned against the system. Of course, the military had no choice but to cancel, or to stop the attempted fifth term, and even threatened, to take over the presidency. And in fact, it was the military guy who was running the country for a short while. But there was a roadmap that the authorities put in place, and the roadmap is not something that the society wants. or the Hirak ones, especially the initial Hirak as it started. They wanted a real change of system. For the first time, you have this, if you recall, during the first Arab Spring, if you wish, there were no slogans for democracy. There were, Arhal and so on and so forth. But with the Algerians, they had a more sophisticated, the calls were more sophisticated, and how to eliminate, to transform. They were calling for genuine transformation and not falling into the trap set by the regime of having its own roadmap and, saying even calling the Hirak a blessed movement and so on and so forth. They wanted really real change. Now, the fortune of the regime is that the pandemic hit, but at the same time with the pandemic, the authorities once again attempted to kill the movement in a sense without violence, but they imprisoned some representatives and so on. And then, now we are, I just want to jump a little bit for the time that is imparted to me, but what you have today is a renewal of the movement. The movement is out, but unlike what happened in when the movement started in February 2019, this time the ideological features are more apparent. Yes, there is a consensus that the political system should change, but the real ideological trends are more apparent now. And unlike the first, the Hirak, the pre-pandemic Hirak, now we see, because of the regime putting this roadmap and wanting new elections, which should be happening, at least they were announced for June next year. And they have been boycotted by the majority of the political parties, especially the secular parties or democratic parties, whatever. And so now the fear is that who is the best organized among them all? The Islamists. The Islamists had disappeared from the picture in Algeria. And now they are back. They are back. Some of them supported from outside. I don't need to name any country and so on, but it is happening and it is real. It is not untrue. So all this is happening, it has been exacerbated by the pandemic, of course, the loss of jobs, the youth having no future, and so on, the price of oil being low, plus the reserves. Just a figure, in 2014, the Algerian reserves were more than $200 billion. So it was a cushion, they could live on that. Now it's less than $40 billion. And so you can buy social peace for a while, but for how long? Now, if that was not enough, in other words, you have the financial, you have the socio-economic, you have, the pandemic, no vaccines around. There were some agreements with the Chinese have done it. Some, they're going to build the factories for the production of the Sputnik 5, in Algeria itself and so on, but it's still not there. It's not available for the majority, of course. It's not available. But as I said, not only is that a problem, but you have also the neighborhood is rotten. The neighborhood, you have instability. The gentleman who spoke earlier about Libya, and that is affecting, Libya is costing Algeria a lot, because of the resources that Algeria has put in the borders. Remember in 2013, there was an attack on the gas plant on the gas plant, and it came from Libya. The jihadists, Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, had come from Libya and attacked the life base and so on. So you have that. You have tensions with Morocco. Now you have, the Western Sahara issue flared up again. You have the normalization between well, it's not really normalization between Morocco and Israel, because they've had a relationship for much longer than people think. But there is this tension which creates, in a sense, where the authorities are alerting the population about the dangers of the situation, but at the same time, the population does not care. Not that they don't care, but it is not, from their perspective, it is something that the authorities are raising to kill the movement and to force upon them the roadmap of the regime itself, so that it can survive.
Oh.
Now, I want to be optimistic. There are some discussions, because within the movement, within this Hirak, there are some really intellectuals who are providing ideas and so on. Now the big discussion is, we don't want these elections. They had forced the regime to make some concessions, like it canceled the National Popular Assembly, the parliament, basically, but because it was made up of people who had been not elected really, but co-opted by the Bouteflika regime, and then they passed a new constitution on November 1st, and the turnout was one of the lowest in Algeria's history. And now the announcement of the elections, the legislative elections, most are going to boycott. And so, and again, as I said, the Islamists would be the best candidate to win everything, like they did in 1991, with the consequences that we know about. So what people are saying, cancel or postpone the legislative elections, have a national conference and sit down and discuss that. And so it is a very, it's an optimistic moment for me, at least as an analyst, and also a dangerous one, because the stakes are extremely high. The authorities are not lying about the dangerous surrounding, but as I tell some of them that I know when I discuss with them, I said, you're not making it any easier. You are shooting yourselves in the foot, because once you make a concession, you pardon prisoners, and then the next day you start putting other prisoners, other people in prison, and you try to restrict, freedom of expression and so on and so forth. And so that is, this is something that the regime has not understood, that they have to push for a real, or to embark on a real dialogue with civil society, with the Hirak in particular, and have a roadmap for a genuine transition. Short of that, the regime will continue facing this unstable situation, and would not have any other choice but to be repressive. And that doesn't bode well for the country. So I have to say, let's wait and see. As I said, there are two in me. There's one part that is optimistic and one part that is less optimistic. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I abused my time.
No, I am sorry that we have to cut it short, because each of the discussions would be very interesting to go on. Okay, we have some very little time, as I am told by the organizers, and I do the nasty job. So I am told that we have very little time, but I would like to try to ask a couple of questions. First one to Annette. Annette, what is the context of the current situation, the clashes on the Sudani and Ethiopian border? If you could briefly comment on that. To Walter, I would like to ask the question also very briefly afterwards. What do you take of Muqtada Sadr's Iraqi national, being a nationalist and this kind of development in spite of him coming from a Shiite background originally? And to Yahya, a very short and very simple one, obviously. What is the Algerian take on President Trump's acknowledgement of Moroccan authority over the Western Sahara? And Laszlo, I will give you leave to just relax and listen to what he answers. Thank you. So first, Annette, please.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, it's not only a current but a very important question right now. So basically, what happened in the Al Fashaka region, the border issue between Ethiopia and Sudan. Once Ethiopia started their war in Tigray against the former government of the TPLF, and the Eritrean army was invited to basically fight because the Ethiopian army was overstretched. They had 15,000 in Somalia. They didn't encounter that basically the TPLF and then the new TDF was coming so strong. So the Sudanese felt it's the right time to claim back a region that basically is theirs. You know, there's a colonial border demarcation, or there was a demarcation. There was a letter from 1902 that Al Fashaka is Sudanese. But there was a deal done during the last administration under Meles Zenawi and Omar al-Bashir to give basically not the land rights, but the land use rights to Ethiopian Amhara farmers. Now that sounds, very innocent, but of course it's not normal Amhara farmers. It's basically large-scale agricultural schemes. The sesame schemes are the sesame that is basically the main export, agricultural export of Ethiopia is planted there. For example, the Ethiopian foreign minister has some stakes in this region. So the Sudanese felt, or Burhan, the head of the army, felt that it's the right time to poke, in Ethiopia because they were weak. So they started this, and what happened since is basically there is, it's quite absurd because both countries are, engaging in a war of words. I mean, so it's becoming really quite difficult to see where the boundaries are. Both sides were mobilizing their regular forces. Both forces were basically crossing. Militias from both sides were engaging. Even the Misaria of Abyei offered the Sudanese army to come and help them. And we have on the other side, we have from, Prime Minister Hamdok and Prime Minister Abiy are saying nobody wants a war. This will not end in a war. The advisors to the prime ministers are saying nobody wants a war. This is just, a bit of tension. And so the problem that we see there right now is threefold. The AU so far has not found a strong mediator to engage the two sides. The new appointment of the new foreign minister in Sudan and the stakes and the interest of the foreign minister, the Ethiopian foreign minister in Al Fashaka, makes it quite difficult because Mariam al-Mahdi, she is using very strong words against the Ethiopians, and this is very closely connected to the GERD, to the Nile water dam, because her primary, let's say, problem is to say that the weaponization of the GERD by the Ethiopians filling the GERD right now in the rainy season has just started. So by this is not only taking away the water that is necessary for electricity, the water that is necessary for the Sudanese dams in the north, the Merowe Dam and others, but it's also a potential weapon that those who are controlling the region that is the Amharas, because nobody believes that the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is really in control of this region. So these very Amharas that are also occupying the Sudanese territory in Al-Fashaka, so they want to link it because they feel if they release after the filling, if they release the big dam, they can just flood, you know, the very important Sudanese Nile riparian agricultural parts, and that of course feels like a threat. The problem is nobody speaks to each other. There is no real communication between the Sudanese and the Ethiopians. The GERD discussions have stalled. The current head of the AU, the DRC, has invited them to come to Kinshasa last week, 2 weeks ago, and nothing is really moving. And so I think one has to link the current war in Tigray with the involvement of the Eritreans, the good relation between the Egyptians and the Eritreans, that of course makes everybody else very very nervous, and specifically the Ethiopians. And the GERD and Al-Fashaka is becoming one cluster. And maybe my last sentence, the Emiratis offered a 3 billion deal. They want to establish a free trade zone in this region. They want to, it's clever actually, they want to invest and compensate the Sudanese for the agricultural scheme run by the Ethiopians, but they also want to have more land for their own food security, so their own investments in Sudan as well as in Ethiopia. The problem is that is on the table, but nobody in the UAE carries it out as a political engagement that would also bring, a political solution to the border issues. So maybe that's all I can say there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vielen Dank, Annette. Walter, so Muqtada Sadr and his trips to Saudi and becoming the Iraqi nationalist, please.
No, he was an Iraqi nationalist from the beginning. The whole Sadr family was Iraqi nationalist, but I think we should look, because in Iraq you really can see the two different visions of how to be an Arab and Iraqi nationalist. The Pan-Arab, the Qawmi nationalism was more aligned with the secular Sunni elites, or in general with the secular left elites, whereas the inner Iraqi view, also reaching out to the Kurds, the Qutri was more aligned with the Shiites, has a little bit to do because the Palestinian cause has been regarded up until the 80s very often as a Arab/Sunni or Arab nationalist secular issue. So as a Shiite, you've been under the suspicion of being half Persian anyway. You would not meddle in the. There have been enough Shiite, also Pan-Arab activists, especially within the secular and the communist field of action. The Sadr family is, of course, multi-ethnic. It's not only him. It's one of these families you simply cannot ignore. Not his closer family, not his wider family. They're related to the Khomeinis, they're related to Musa al-Sadr, they're related to many others. But I think the more interesting person is Ayatollah Sadiq Hussein al-Sadr, his Muqtada's uncle, who basically runs Qasemain. And he was very suspicious of the Iranian, or let's call it the revolutionary Shia tradition, which is the official ideology in Iran anyway. And Muqtada is in the same fold. The whole concept of velayat-e-faqih for them is, for the Ayatollahs, it's more a problem of concept. This is a novelty. And there the accusation goes, what you dream of a pan-Islamic leadership turns out to Iranian hegemony, and we don't want either of it because it won't work. You cannot even convince your own Sunnis of this system as being Islamic. So how do you think it would work in the region? For Muqtada, it's more pragmatic. The man is cunning, intelligent, but has nothing of a philosophical or ideological base. He's a natural born street smart populist. He has a network to run. He gave up on his militia when the most important military factions broke away and were cooperated with the Iranians like Kataib, Hezbollah, not Said al-Shoda, and others, and Asaib al-Haq and so on. And but he has not gained his place within the clerical system, and he needs money. He needs a lot of money, and the Iranians don't give him, or the price the Iranians would put in. In Iran, ideology comes first, and being Shiite, it's not enough to be anti-American, given so many anti-American Shiites in Iraq. So he did his own deal and simply went to the Saudis. But not only this, half the former Badr Corps switched over to the Saudis. So it's more pragmatic. Of course, people don't go with Shiite flags and us, but for those who are politically motivated, killing Ayatollah Nimr al-Nimr, as the Saudis did a few years ago, was really shocking. On the other hand, for people like Muqtada and for his very low-class followers, that's just one Ayatollah of many. And they have an anti-clerical stride in it. A very strange anti-clerical, almost chiastic stride. Think of the Army of Heaven of this Al-Hassan guy in Basra, who almost went down up to Najaf and wanted to kill all the Ayatollahs and so on. And these people took the money from the Saudis. The great question is whether the Saudis can deal with them. I mean, they're so crazy a hot potato that the Iranians burned their fingers. And the Iranians, I suppose, know a little bit more about Shiaism than or Iranian intel officers. We're talking not about clerics, than the Saudis. However, it works, and the Saudis are much more, how should I say, they must have learned or gotten a lot of other signals from the Shiite clergy and from the Iranians that all this setup of militias and armed gangs and armed groups the Iranians are building up or have built up will not be used against them in the first place and their friends. And secondly, taking into consideration that Iran is as overstretched as Israel is, it is from the Saudis a smart move to have a foot into the Shiite system, and sponsoring Muqtada now is, of course, something many people in Tehran will find shocking and disturbing. But obviously, Iraqi Shiites are very self-confident, and they're especially self-confident against Iran, because this is just an additional information for all of you. Just don't quote me as a source. The Shiite militias, the so-called Shiite militias, are in a position to pick the Iranian intelligence operatives for a very simple reason. The Iranians have no access to Swift code or whatever. So if you're an Iranian intelligence officer, the Shiite organization, including the Lebanese Hezbollah, can say, we want you, we want this guy, we want that guy. We don't want an anonymous spy master in Tehran to run us. And then this guy will get an account in the bank we have our friends in. That's quite powerful. And the incentive, intelligence professionals are professionals first. Whether they're intelligent is another question. But first, they have also their families, they have their dreams. And it's not an easy job to go to Iraq, to go to Syria, to go to Lebanon, being under the permanent watch of the US, of the Israelis, of the whole Western world, of whatsoever radical Sunni jihadi group and so on. So they're quite in an interesting position. And the overall thing, I think also for public diplomacy, the Europeans should they should not meddle into this inner Shiite strife when you don't understand it. The things are rather simple, but the way it is presented to the public, both to the Arab public and to the international public, is simply wrong. So therefore, yes, this trend of Iraqi nationalism within Shiism has always been there, but they were grateful to Iran because Iran helped them for a while, and a handful will clinch on the ideological system, but that's over.
Thank you very much, Walter. Thank you. That was very interesting. And Yahya, the last question and the last answer before we conclude. Yes, please, Yahya.
Okay, you asked me about Algeria's reaction.
Yes.
Algeria was not too surprised by the fact that there was a sort of normalization in the making. But the way they took it was, you know, it doesn't really matter. Trump cannot do it like that. The UN rejected it. The African Union rejected it. The Europeans rejected it in some ways. But there are some very, very serious implications. You know, Algeria has, if you know the regime, whatever your opinion of it, it has always been non-aligned. This was a position they adopted since 1955 when they were just revolutionaries, okay? And they have more or less good, decent relations with everyone. However, the fact that Algeria now, you know, feels cornered will have geopolitical implications. That is a move closer to Russia, a move closer to China. Some Europeans fine, but in the eyes also, if you take the population is absolutely opposed to this normalization without a resolution of the Palestinian question. The Algerians identify with the Palestinian question. So do the Moroccans, the population, not the Makhzen. And so in that sense, there is anger, and you probably have seen that the Hirak in its weekly marches is targeting France. This was really unusual because they know that France is the main supporter of Morocco in the region. And so there is hope that Biden will, you know, people like Bolton, Christopher Ross, they're all calling for rescinding that decision. So as we are speaking right now, in a few hours, the Security Council will be meeting to discuss the Western Sahara issue. And it's very important to put this in perspective because Blinken has already hinted that there are a lot of decisions that will be undone. One of which was the withdrawal from the climate, you know, agreement or the World Health Organization and so on. So there is hope that something will happen. If you ask me, I don't think the US would condone or would maintain that. I'm not sure. They would look for some sort of loophole, because don't forget what that decision from Trump does is that it makes a mockery of international law. The Western Sahara is, whether one likes the Moroccans or not, whatever the, you know, one's thinking, it is an illegally occupied territory. It was, you know, there was a ceasefire. The Moroccans were encouraged to go to that zone, the Gargarat, you know, which was a no man's land, basically. And so now we have a war going on. People don't, it's a low intensity conflict, but it is going on with very serious implications, because God forbid, if there is a miscalculation on Morocco's part and with Israeli presence and whatnot, because they are advisors and so it will be a catastrophe for the region. So I think that the Security Council and the United States in particular will try to find a way out, a face-saving solution, just to reinstate the status quo. The issue is the Sahrawis don't want the status quo. They have been promised to have a referendum on self-determination. The MINURSO, it's the French acronym for the United Nations Mission for Referendum in Western Sahara. And now you're going to see that even Russia is going to play international law, international legality. And so how is the US going to react to that? I don't know. I know one thing, the border, under Trump, they removed the border from the maps, from the official maps in the State Department. Now there is the border. So whether this is an indication of what might happen, I don't know. But I think that Trump wanted, and I spoke with the US officials, wanted to poison Biden's foreign policy, to make it much more difficult, after he was gone.
Yeah.
Voilà.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yahya. And I think I was asked by the organizers to thank all of you speaking on this panel, László Csicsman, Annette Weber, Walter Posch, and Yahya Zubir, as well as the speakers in the first panel, Gamal Salim, and the colleagues who are the organizers, by the way. So we all thank ourselves as well. And I think that this was a very, very interesting conference. The only pity is that we couldn't do it in person, but we were very happy to see you, at least via the internet. And we sincerely hope that maybe next time we can meet personally as well. So with that, I would like to thank you again for this great opportunity. I have learned a lot personally myself, and I hope that the audience as well. I would also like to thank the audience for keeping with us. And with that, I would like to conclude our conference. And thank you so much. I see Walter, your Hungarian is still there. So köszönöm in Hungarian. And hope to see you again, and very, very soon. So goodbye and thank you again. Bye.